So it seems we just kicked off the live streaming. So for all of you online, for information, we'll wait for another 2 or 3 minutes before starting, as the room is still filling up. Thank you. Full blown information, responding to a few questions. Finance is these to do advocacy campaign to make sure we land an ambitious agenda. So why this workshop and why the 2 sessions? This workshop because we believe as Finance Watch that the current sustainable finance agenda suffers from 2 major flaws. The first one is that it fails to challenge the structure and the fundamentals of the economy. So in a nutshell, 40 years of financialization. And the second one is that it takes a narrow view on climate risk rather than looking at the bigger picture of nature and the environment in a holistic way. So that's why we do the workshop. Why the 2 sessions? Because we believe being smart and getting what we need to do ultimately won't be enough. So getting this Finance for Nature agenda from a conceptual perspective won't be implemented if there's not an active coalition using all types of strategies, pushing in all the different types of levels to make it land and start to be implemented. That is to say that this workshop is meant to be the start of a collaboration, and so we'll be hopefully engaging with as many of you as possible in the coming weeks and months after the workshop. Now, in a few words, what is our approach as Finance Watch to this question? As you've read in the invitation, we'll be publishing a detailed report on this issue, authored by my colleague Ludovic, who's in the room. He'll be doing a separate webinar to go in details through the technical arguments we make in the report. So at this stage, I'd like to paint with a broad brush or approach before leaving expert speakers to take the floor and create a discussion with you. As I alluded to earlier, we think you cannot take the financial system as we know it for granted. So our economy as a whole has undergone a massive transformation over the last 40 years. As I said, we live now in an ultra-financialized economy with too big to fail banks, other financial institutions, financial markets basically being in command. And that doesn't work. We see that doesn't work. The main reason is financial markets have no direction, or rather they go blindly after short-term profit. And if you allow me, it's sort of because they're not causal relationships. But if you do look at some financial indicators in terms of profits on financial markets, in terms of liberalization and financialization, the IMF is measuring this. You look at these trends over the last 40 years, you look at the trends in terms of biodiversity, in terms of CO2 emissions, and quite unfortunately they are inversely correlated. So that there is a strong negative relationship between the way we've transformed our economy and what's been happening to nature that we see now and that we need to address. Now, in the paper we'll be publishing in a few days, we make four major points, and this is where Ludovic, the author, is going to hate me for vulgarizing his research, so I know that already. So the 4 points are pretty basic, and they do relate to this mapping that you see there of how we take a big picture at what is the financial system and what are some of the key elements that need to change. Obviously also being aware, and this will be discussed in the second session, of all the different actors, but there aren't so many actually, active at different places on this map to make sure we move from this picture, which we call finance ignoring nature, sometimes finance against nature or exploiting nature, to something that we want to call finance for nature or supporting nature. So these 4 points are basically that the first one is that we need political ambition. That's what kids in the streets are asking us, and that's it's basically taking action and having a public political commitment that nature as a whole is an issue. We all know climate is an issue. The IPCC tells us we have 10 years to transform the economy. The IPBES report of last week tells us basically the environment as a whole is at a major risk of going down, or rather letting humans down actually. So we need this political ambition. It's also about giving a strong signal to financial markets. So this is not just about heads of states agreeing on some nice report. It's also giving a signal, as the Paris Agreement gave to financial markets to some extent, and created this whole machine to look at how we can integrate climate risk, but also impact into the economy to generate the same sort of momentum on biodiversity and ecosystems. So that's the first point. And that's basically the superior part of this graph, where you have public authorities, governments, which need to regain some ambition. The second element is about, it's there, it's just a step below, it's about central banks, supervisors, basically regulators of the current financial system, so the system as it is. We've seen quite some progress since the Paris Agreement as to the way these supervisors and mainly central bankers, you've heard about the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of central bankers thinking as to how to integrate climate risk within the financial system. We think these stakeholders should broaden their agenda from the sort of narrow climate risk perspective to the bigger environmental risk perspective. So that's using the whole macro-prudential toolbox, certainly, and that is what's slowly going on. Still in speeches, not so much in action, so they need to move forward. But also, quite crucially, monetary policy, which for now is being left aside. There is a case to say that nature is the ultimate too big to fail, and that's, you would need a massive bailout immediately. You need to bail out nature now, because the whole of the economy and societies rely on it. So we know there's been a massive bailout after the financial crisis a few years ago. The way it's being done, so these monetary policy instruments, it's been implemented in a really blind manner, so-called neutral to the direction of the economy, which has resulted, unfortunately, is in a major boost for a fossil fuel economy. So we can't stay there, and we need to look at monetary policy as well. So that's the political ambition that needs to translate into the mandate of central bankers and using the whole toolbox. The third key element is the recognition, which is explored by Ludovic in the paper, that there's an inherent limitation to what private finance can do to restore and conserve ecosystem. So there's been amazing work in a field called conservation finance, which we might discuss today. We discuss at length in the paper. And so this is not to say we should abandon these efforts. It's just to recognize we're currently estimating that there's about $50 billion going into conservation finance on a yearly basis. Mind you, 80% of that is actually public finance or philanthropy, so only 20% actually comes from private actors. There are estimations, we think very optimistic, which say this could be scaled up to around 400 billion. We basically think that's unrealistic. Even if that was the case, it could possibly take a long time. And so we just can't rely only on private finance. We need to unlock the real patient and if you like, mission-oriented capital in its DNA, which is public finance, public investment plans, sort of recapitalizing public banks, because we think from the political ambition, they have the strong if you like, transmission mechanism to quickly kick off this restoration and conservation of nature. Some we call it a Green New Deal. Again, we detail in the paper what we understand by unlocking patient capital and public finance. We think that's basically the third component. And the last component is the prerequisite for all of this. So that basically, even if you have a massive political commitment, and you say, okay, this is it, nature is a big issue, we hear the IPBES reports, we need a major deal, maybe at the COP15 of CBD next year in China, maybe before, maybe after. Even when you do that, you still, this is about transforming the economy and the financial system, you sort of need a control panel, if you like. You need to press all the buttons, and that is to say you need data, you need indicators, you need measures to understand where biodiversity, ecosystem services suffer the most, and what is the relationship with the economy, and how basically press these buttons that will rapidly transform the economy. And we think in this space, the concepts and the whole set of work that's being performed in the area of what's called natural capital, but also ecosystem services, as I alluded to, in terms of valuation, in terms of stakeholders involved, is the most advanced set, the most advanced toolbox, if you like, to translate this issue of nature biodiversity, which the wide public will understand this way, in a language that policymakers, whether it's the Ministry of the Economy, the Ministry of Finance, but also markets in the economy can understand, and because we need this to happen very fast, you need as I said, the data and the transmission mechanisms to make it transform the political vision into reality. So we think there's a wealth of resources in there which needs to be developed. So these are this is basically the big picture we take, so that hopefully with this agenda, and we'll discuss later this afternoon the opportunities to push for this agenda, we land in a place where ultimately biodiversity ecosystems are restored, but we've transformed the economy and the financial system to be much more balanced, and where indeed sort of the public interest democratic vision is much more transmitted to a financial system which is reorganized in a way that the economy is transformed and becomes really sustainable. So again, this is the big picture that we detail in the paper. We'll be now starting a discussion with our speakers and go back to some of these concepts one by one. So the way this will work is that we'll have now two speakers, first Thomas Hahn and then Rens van Tilburg, speaking for about 15 minutes. After each of their presentation, we'll have a quick Q&A. So for those people who are online, feel free to already send questions during their presentations. And then after those, we'll open the floor for a broader discussion before we quickly break before the second session. So we'll first now listen to Thomas Hahn, who is an associate professor at Stockholm University. He's part of the prestigious Stockholm Resilience Center, which is famous for having created this idea and concept and reality, unfortunately, of the planetary boundaries, and how we've already crossed 4 of them, including the one on biodiversity. His research focuses on ecological and institutional economics in relation with ecosystem services, but he's also worked a lot on financial instruments and what type of governance we need for social ecological systems to evolve. So we'll now listen to Thomas. The floor is yours for about 15 minutes, and then we take a few questions and move on.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'll have a presentation of about 12, 13 slides. Are they on now? Yeah. So on the first slide, let's see, can I see it on the screens? Is it possible for me to see the slides?
It'll be up in a second.
Yeah. So I know where we are. Thank you also for making it possible to participate on video. We have a travel policy at Stockholm Resilience Center, so we should avoid traveling. We should instead use Zoom and other video conference devices. So I'm very happy that we do that now.
Yeah, we also think it's the way forward, and so as we all know as humans, we're not quite there yet with all of this being fluid. So I'll ask for a bit of patience for everyone. But
Thank you.
Your presentation should be up any second now, or any minute.
Okay. So I'm I have a background in agriculture and economics, and I'm doing research and teaching in ecological economics. And so I start with my presentation here. As you might know, there was a global assessment of the IPBES, the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And this was launched last week. Yeah, now I see it. Thank you. You can take the next one. I will start talking about this IPBES assessment, and then I'll talk about green growth, D growth, and A growth, and transformations. And then I'll make some comments on biodiversity, if Markus can say biodiversity. The next picture, good if I can see the picture also. Yes, thank you. So this was launched just last week, this global assessment. And there are 4 key messages, 4 parts. So part D is policy and governance part. And the main findings is nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably, blah, 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 through urgent and concerted efforts fostering transformative change. So transformative change was actually the emphasized words in this whole assessment. And I think that's a novel finding, that now the international global assessments, they talk about transformative change. Can you come back to the presentation? Yeah, thank you. And they actually talk about economic growth. So this is the first time that global ecosystem assessments says that we must steer away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth. These are quite strong words if you consider that most governments and also the SDGs are still obsessed by economic growth. So I think it's an important summary for policymakers. So these are direct citations from the summary for policymakers. It is still not available online. It was decided last week by the panel of IPBES in Paris, and it will be published on the IPBES homepage, you see that below, within a week, I think. So these are quite strong words calling for transformative change. And one of these transformative changes is, of course, to change the taxation system. And it's quite depressive to see that the share of total taxes in the European Union has not increased for the last 15 years. On the contrary, it has reduced from almost 7% to about 6%. And the share of GDP, the total environmental taxes share of GDP is just a bit more than 2%. And of course, anyone with some education in economics understands that the incentives are important to change. If it's very cheap to destroy nature, if it's cheap to use fossil fuels and degrade ecosystems, then this will be rewarded. This behavior will be rewarded by the economy. So of course this has to be changed. I think it's a scandal that the European Union, which speaks most about the green economy and having to change the incentives and change economic drivers, are not doing more than this. Of course, we're doing something in the emission trading system, but we also have to change environmental taxes at national level. This is not done. Next, please. There is a lot of talk about decoupling, and Sweden is sometimes put forward as the model for decoupling, because Sweden has grown the GDP for about 30% during the last 10 or 15 years, where at the same time as the carbon dioxide emissions have decreased. But that's only on the territorial level. If you also include international flights and international shipping, then this changes a lot. And if you look at consumption, the Swedish footprint is very large. So decoupling may work in small sectors. It might work during small particular time periods, but on the whole, it doesn't work. So the figure on the use of natural resources is quite bad news for the world. So we don't have global decoupling, and therefore we don't have a green growth. Next, please. Here is the model that we are taught in economics, all the students. They still learn this model. It's the same thing as 40, 50, 60 years ago, where basically households and firms exchange labor and salaries. And the financial sector is somewhere between here, inside this. The next, please. If you want to make this model more realistic, we have to start including the voluntary unpaid work. Next, please. Made usually by mothers and also fathers to raise children. All this domestic work that is important. And all the other things in society, the rule of law, democracy and freedom, good institutions, etc. If those things do not work, then the economy will also fail to provide good quality of life. But that's not enough. It's not only society. We have to also include, next please, we have to include the work by the biosphere. And then we have the natural resources and ecosystem services, which you can see as unpaid work. In the next please. And then the thermodynamic aspects, the sunlight and the heat and waste. So this is a more realistic picture of the economy. And I'm afraid that today's economists, they're still not learning this realistic framework. So they still see the economic system as the big system. And you can still study the financial system as something productive, which is, of course, is not very productive. Next one. If you look at the SDGs are cherished because they are, well, it's a global consensus of what we should strive for. But it's also problematic because it puts a lot of weight on economic growth. Not only developing countries, but also developed countries should grow additional growth. When Wackernagel analyzed this and did some indicators on which are the countries scoring the highest according to the SDGs indicators, then he found that the West European countries are scoring highest. Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Finland are number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, I think there, and also other Western European countries. But they also are the countries that are extremely overshoot when it comes to ecological footprint. So there are hardly any countries, actually there's no country reaching Human Development Index more than 80%, at the same time staying at only one planet. So there is some problem with the current developments. And the SDGs will unfortunately not help us, because the SDGs reward the countries who have really high footprints. Next, please. So we need new paradigms, and I think the new IPBES assessment is actually the first one that is talking about degrowth, or at least questioning growth. And I think academically, there are two different schools questioning the growth paradigm. The first one is degrowth. It's often used as a catchword for sustainability transformations. I find it a bit confusing because the term degrowth, it sounds like the aim is to shrink the GDP. And I think things have to increase at the same time as other things in the economy have to increase. So there must be increasing and decreasing at the same time. The sustainable parts of the economy have to increase, and the unsustainable part, the fossil fuel and overconsumption, have to decrease. And I call that a transformation. And Jeroen van den Berg, who is a Dutch economist, Dutch ecological economist, he says that we should be agnostic about GDP growth, because we can all agree that sustainable investment and consumption must increase. And then the next line is that unsustainable investment and unsustainable consumption must decrease. And this is somehow more difficult to accept for the present government in the European Union and worldwide, because most of the governments are obsessed by GDP growth. But both of these messages are equally important. You have to grow the good sectors and you have to degrow the bad sectors. Next, please. I call that sustainability transformations. And I have an example with Sweden and Bangladesh. In Sweden, the PPP dollar per capita today, that is purchasing power parity, GDP per capita, is $50,000. And I assume here that 4/5 are unsustainable because it's still a fossil economy. And most of our imports and consumption is very fossil rich. And 10,000 are sustainable. This has to be changed. So the unsustainable part have to decrease very much, and the sustainable parts have to increase. And the net effect is not so important. In my diagram, the net effect is actually a bit degrowth at the macro scale. But as you see, the important thing here happening is that the unsustainable part is decreasing and the sustainable part is increasing. And I call that transformation. For Bangladesh, I assume here that they are both of the same size, the unsustainable and sustainable part. And Bangladesh, I think they can afford to use a little bit more natural resources and a little bit more of unsustainable economy. But of course, it is the sustainable parts that have to increase. So we have, of course, different challenges in low-income countries and high-income countries. But it's the same kind of, it's the same target, the transformation. I think we can still use the word degrowth, but I don't. I like the ideas of degrowth. I think it's important, but I think they should emphasize the word transformation instead. Next, please. I've done some research on biodiversity, because there's a hype right now in the CBD and the European Union that markets can save biodiversity. And this is based on a neoliberal view that markets are more efficient. But this actually, it works quite well when both the consumer and the producer know exactly what they are trading. But when we trade public goods, like biodiversity conservation, then both the seller and the buyer have incentives to compromise the quality. And you need strong government regulations and enforcement to ensure quality. And that means transaction cost. So actually, it's a flaw argument. It doesn't really work. That just say that because markets are efficient in providing us ordinary goods, private goods, therefore they should also be efficient in providing us public goods. No, it's a classic market failure. And it requires very strong incentives from the government side to make this efficient. Next, please. So the market, if you have these markets for ecosystem services, you actually require more government regulations. I also studied this payments for ecosystem services. And the first question is, are these actually market tools or are they government subsidies? And when you study this empirically, you find that what you commodify is not the service itself. It's not biodiversity or the service. What you commodify is usually the land use. So farmers, for example, they get a certain payment for each hectare of certain land use. So I think it's a quite low degree of commodification in this sense, because you don't commodify the product. And then when you look at it, who is paying for these things? It's actually governments paying for most of it. So the government's paid for about 97 or 99% of all these things, a bit more in developed, a bit more in low-income countries. And it's more like a state government-paid subsidy provided to farmers and other forest owners in Costa Rica, for example, who provide, who stop clear cutting. And the governments, they use price signal, so they use, they give a certain amount of money, like 200 euros per hectare or something. That's an economic instrument, but it's not a market instrument, because market means market mechanism. When you have market mechanism, it's about determining the price between supply and demand. So it's not a market instrument. It's actually it's an economic instrument, but you can see this payment for services. It's not a private tool. It's actually mainly a government tool using the price signal. I think we should not confuse these things. There are very, very few examples of pure private PES. So these things are not actually private solutions. So when you see the payments for ecosystem services, it's mainly government tools using price signals. So I don't think we should attribute these things to the market. And the successful case in Costa Rica is successful just because it's a government policy paid to land users and landowners as a compensation for the national prohibition of clear cutting. So the new forest law prohibits people to clear cut forests, and then they give some compensation to the landowners. I don't see any market in that. Finally, we've also done some research on impact investment together with my PhD student, Ami Golland. And we found that when these for-profit conservation case studies, when you find these things, they usually work quite nicely. And it's because they can combine conservation of biodiversity with selling some eco-certified cocoa or eco-certified bananas or coffee. So they are able to actually make some of the benefits privatize, which is good. So we find some successful cases when you can actually combine development and giving sustainable revenues, and you can have some growing income for these low-income communities. But we also find that these communities have often a history of public aid. So there have been public investments in infrastructure and human capital and social capital. So it's easier for the private sector to enter a place where they built up trust, they have built up some networks with Western agencies, Western NGOs, and then it's easier to actually start this for-profit conservation based on an ordinary commodity product. So I don't think this is the really fancy investment or innovation, because you find eco-certification at other places too. Yeah, I think it's good. I think there is no idea to be against this impact investment, but it's very, very hard to scale out or scale up. Scaling out means replicating this elsewhere, and scaling up means mainstreaming into institutions, to change the institutions of the European Unions. For example, to invite more private business in the foreign aid. But that's very difficult, because you have to invest in human capital and social capital before you can do this good products, good projects. Finally, my experience from the IPBES. The next slide, please. I was working in the European and Central Asian assessment as one of the coordinating lead authors. And we found that there are many good examples of improvements of biodiversity. And this is almost always thanks to regulations and institutional drivers made by the European Union and all these habitat and birds and directives and so on. So we have done these things to slow down biodiversity loss of some particular ecosystems and some particular biodiversity. We've improved the status of some threatened species. We decreased nitrogen, phosphorus, and other pollutions. So we can see that environmental politics actually work. When we do concerted efforts, it works. Next, please. But at the same time, we have the economic drivers, like growth and trade and employment policies. And these all result in worse conditions. So we have worse effects on ecosystems and biodiversity. The next one. So the problem here is that the institutional drivers are improving the situation. We're actually responding to these problems, but the economic drivers are working in the opposite direction, because we still want to promote economic growth. So the net effect is usually negative, because we have increasing GDP, and you might have heard of the rebound effect, that we might use technological change sometimes to use less petrol in our cars, but then because it becomes cheaper to drive the cars, then we drive more, and the efficiency gains are eaten up by the consumption increase. And this is what happens all the time in the European Union. And as long as we have the GDP growth as the major political aim in our economies, it's quite impossible to have a sustainable development. And the good thing is that the new global assessment from the IPBES is actually saying these things. For the first time, I think, there are clear statements about this thing. So we have some good reports to cite in the future. Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience before we move on to the second speaker. So, yeah, Thomas, a few points. So I think you looked at sort of the balance or the difference between public approaches and public investments and the political ambition on one side, and then market mechanisms. I think you highlighted the fact that the current economic theory, or sometimes borderline ideology, is a blocking factor in itself, looking at an excessive focus on GDP. Now, I'll kick off by asking you one question. When you did mention tax, because of course, as soon as you mentioned the fact that, which I think is your underlying narrative, that we do need strong public leadership, both politically but also in terms of financing, is where you're going to find the money, right? So we did allude ourselves to monetary policy, public banks, etc. But ultimately, there is something around the resources of the state, and there's a slide where you mentioned tax. You only covered it briefly, and it sounded like you were just asking for more taxes. Now, we all understand in the current environment, and we've seen, we in Brussels here, so we've seen experiments just across the border south about increasing some taxes in relation with the environment, which I think was quite a clumsy move for good reason. So how would you see that? You want to elaborate a bit on some taxes should increase in a way that connects with a strong popular sentiment that we do need to do something for climate and nature, but maybe that some of the instruments, or rather the type of people who should be paying, should be specific.
Yeah, I think it's tax reforms are very important, and there has been discussion on the financial tax, financial transaction tax in the European Union, and if I have correct information, this financial transaction tax proposal was a European tax. And then, of course, the countries with large financial sectors like the UK will pay a lot of money to the European Union. So maybe that was not a good idea, but maybe the European Union should have should require that all member states have imposed financial transaction taxes on their own industries. So the national taxation, there has to be a national taxation. So somehow the financial sector must shrink because it has become too big. And now we see in Sweden, if you ever heard of the Swedbank scandal, where one of the biggest Swedish banks have been used for money laundering by Russians and by other people. And this is what happens when you give strong incentives to the banks to behave in an antisocial way. I think it's payback time for the financial system. I do believe in regulations. I haven't done research on what kind of regulations are needed, so I don't want to speak about that. But I'm also involved in the positive money in Sweden, and I think positive money is one suggestion that both the Bank of England and the Bank of Sweden is proposing. So it is actually on the table, on the government's table now to discuss the electronic money. And one good thing, of course, is that we can reduce our dependence on the commercial banks for our transactions, etc. So I do think there are transformative changes needed, both in taxation and in the financial system as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Just a piece of information. Indeed, this idea of a financial transaction tax is remaining an ID for the moment, including the EU. So we still nowhere until seeing it. I don't. Do I see? Is there a question in the audience here, in person or online? If that's not the case, and in the meantime, anyway, I'll ask Rens from Tilburg to to join me and actually replace me for the second presentation. Rens is the director. Is there a question over there? Yeah, please, Sebastian.
Hi, thanks. Sebastian with WWF. How do we convince politicians to stop buying the growth narrative? Because they are completely growth brainwashed. I think in virtually all member states in Europe, and including in the Parliament, probably all political groups to a large extent. Can we use notably the argument, the economic analysis, that the correlation between economic growth and employment, or between economic growth and reduction of inequalities, is increasingly weak? The IMF already years ago did analysis on this, and they didn't find any correlation anymore between economic growth and job creation in countries like Japan or Switzerland, and very weak correlations in Italy or other European countries, which means increasingly these key social and environmental issues rely on policies. They rely increasingly less on economic growth, according to the IMF economic analysis. Can we use this? Can we deepen this to show actually these correlations are becoming completely relevant? So that would mean that pushing for more growth doesn't have any potential positive impact on job creation or reduction of inequalities or environmental protection, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I totally agree. I think these research findings are important to spread. I think most research findings so far, there are many different calls and different research platforms emphasizing that continuous growth does not improve human well-being. And I think this message has come through to politicians. But the second thing they talk about, the growth issue, has not, the employment issue has not come through. I speak a lot to politicians, mainly in Sweden. I also run for the European Parliament now, for a new Green Party in Sweden. I'm number 5 on the list. And I speak to politicians, and they say that, okay, we understand that GDP growth does not improve life conditions or quality of life, but without growth, we'll have massive unemployment. And then I say, well, just look at the proposals by the growth research people. They suggest universal basic income, or they suggest 6-hour working day. And then you can work you can start the 6-hour working days maybe in the hard labor sectors, because people like myself will not work less just because we get a 6-hour day. So start with the hard labor sectors, and that's also a way to reduce unemployment. And I don't actually see why. There have been some small attempts to do experiments and to do testing on universal basic income, but there's surprisingly little experiments by governments to do these things in European countries. And the New Zealand government has introduced a new way to measure welfare. That's fine, but you also have to work on the labor market. How can we change the way that people are not expelled from security? People can still feel that they are part of the economy, they're part of the welfare, even though they are losers. So I think the present neoliberal framework is that if you don't compete, if you don't succeed, then you're outside, you're unemployed, and then you don't get involved in the welfare sector. But to change that, but to make sure that everyone is part of the welfare sector, everyone receives welfare, no one has to fear that they will be outcast, they are thrown out of the comfortable life. And this can be done either by universal basic income or by a dramatic decrease in the labor week, in the hours we work. And I don't know why are politicians so reluctant to even experiment on these things? I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. There is a question online which is asking you to elaborate a bit more about what you mean by transformative changes. I think you just alluded to it now, but I would propose we move now to the second presentation of Rens of Tilburg, and then we come back to this question, which is obviously fundamental, which is what is this transformative change in the economy and possibly in the financial system. So Rens, if you want to come up, Rens is the executive director of the Sustainable Finance Lab in the Netherlands. He's been one of the pioneers working on climate risk. He's also worked 20 years ago in the European Parliament as an economist, as an advisor to the Green Party and then the Dutch government. And he's been working on the financial sector and the intersection between the financial sector and the environment, specifically for the last 10 years since the crisis, basically. So Rens, I will give you this microphone, I think, and the presentation is right there.
Okay. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk here, specifically about the financial sector and biodiversity. So well, let me start by echoing what Professor Hahn has just said. I think that's a very important message to hammer home, so to say. It is that, yes, I do think that the financial sector can play a positive role, much more than it is currently done in preserving natural capital, biodiversity, but let's not think that that is a substitute for public policies. And in the discussion, often people who, for the best reasons, are very enthusiastic about the possibilities of private finance may sort of like become over-enthusiastic and think, well, they will solve all the problems. And I think they will definitely not do that. Where I do see a great potential, and I think in a sense we are already seeing that a bit more when it gets to the issue of climate change, is that the moment that the private financial sector realizes how they are related, how they are exposed to the issue, then they do become more active, and that can have a positive impact. And so I think over the recent years, after the Paris Accord on climate, the financial sector has sort of like woken up to this issue, and it's really becoming more and more effective in also doing things to remedy the problem. We see divestment, but also I think even more promising forms of engagement that really start to bite with, for instance, oil companies, who for a long time in their shareholder meetings had NGOs that were waving that they were also having shares and that they demanded different practices, but they were more or less ignored by those oil companies, and it's much harder to ignore your shareholders if they become to 10, 20, sometimes even majority, and that's what we're increasingly seeing. So something like the Climate Action 100 Plus unites a lot of big institutional investors from almost all over the world, and that really does have an impact. So I think if we could get the financial sector to work on biodiversity as they are increasingly doing on climate change, that can really be a force for good. But always keep in mind, they actually do that, especially if they operate from the risk perspective, because they think that somewhere along the line, somewhere in the future, public policies might be implemented that will actually start shifting the economy, and they have to be prepared for that. So the financial sector, because they operate on expectations, if they change those expectations, they start changing the current reality. Well, that's more or less why I'm working at the Sustainable Finance Lab, which is a think tank in the Netherlands, with mostly professors from different universities. And we have a secretariat at Utrecht University, where 6 people are doing research. About 5-6 years ago, we started doing the research into the relationship between climate and financial risks. And about 3-4 years ago, also looking how we could use the concepts that we developed in climate finance, also in regard to biodiversity. And I'm very happy because it's been actually quite lonely in that space and quite quiet. That recently there has really been a take-up also from the private financial sector in this. So in the Netherlands we have a group of financial institutions who started to work on this as well. So maybe a little bit on the basics. I think this one we've already seen in earlier presentations. The 6 capitals of integrated reporting. I like to present them more like this, where you really can see there is a base of natural capital on which, in essence, everything else on the world is built. The social relationships we have, the society, the economy that we build on that, and on top of that we have a financial sector. As we've seen in climate, increasingly in the financial sector, people are starting to understand that they really depend on what is below. If things go wrong, lower up in that pyramid, that will also in the end affect them. Well, things are going wrong. This is a picture I stole from Professor Hahn's organization. So we see, yes, on climate change we are already exceeding the planetary boundaries, but much more so on biodiversity and on nitrogen. So there is a case, and this picture I think is very powerful. I always show it when I make presentations to the financial sector people about climate change. I end with this picture saying like, okay, you're working now on this climate problem, but do realize that there are other planetary boundaries which are just as essential and which we have already broken much more severely. Now, so I'm very happy with Finance Watch taking up this work, and broadly speaking, I subscribe to almost everything that's in the paper of Ludovic, but allow me to add a few things there. The first one is, I think there is a strong distinction made between what public policy can do for serving the public interest, and on the other hand, what the private sector can do, and then risk return is important, and people want to earn money, which of course is true, but at the same time, also in the private sector, there is a lot happening also. Sometimes it's called impact investing, but there's many other terms for it. And also in the private sector there is a genuine appetite, and I think also an appetite that can be much enhanced in the coming years to do good, actually. So what I show here is a recent research done by some economists from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, which to my knowledge is one of the first more or less academic questionnaires done to pension fund members, and they were asked, do you want your pension funds to go into a direction in which there will be more positive impact for the world, but it will be at a cost for you financially? And still also then quite a large part of those people say, yes, I want to go into that direction. And actually the discussion that we are having in the Netherlands now is, what does that mean? Does that mean that the pension fund should actually also be doing investments in which they know they will get a lower financial return, but their members will get a higher impact? And if that's what they want, it's their money, should you not be doing it? So interesting discussion, because what you've seen in the Netherlands is that most pension funds have said, okay, we do recognize that our members, they want to have this positive impact, so we are going to try to steer in that direction, but only as far as it doesn't hurt our financial performance. Well, but maybe this trade-off is also acceptable for at least quite a large part of your members. What should you be doing? Same thing with the central banks. I'll be talking more about them from their risk perspective, from their targets, their primary targets, so to say. But I think also here we should think about the secondary targets that also the European Central Bank has. So what we see here is from the European Treaty that clearly says the primary objective of the central bank, that's the price stability. But when it's possible to do other things that serve the European Union, like supporting sustainable development, improving the quality of the environment, then the European Central Bank should be doing that as well. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for central banks to actually do improve the sustainability of the European society without any prejudice to their primary objective. And this is also increasingly recognized internationally. So we have this network for greening the financial system, which unites a lot of central banks, including the European Central Bank. And they have work streams looking into the relationship, until now mostly about climate, on macro and micro-prudential regulation, so the risk perspective. But they also have a work stream which is about scaling up green finance. So I think there's a clear recognition, a growing recognition with also central banks supervisors, that they also want to do good, as long as it doesn't hurt their primary objectives. So also we should be thinking about how we can use this. And in the report of Finance Watch, there's mention made of this mission-oriented policies. There's a new talk, I would say, in Europe about this, and I think this should also involve central banks. Well, then I get to what I've been working on most, and what's the core of my presentation. So that is this risk perspective. And what we've seen happening in climate change, and I think this nicely sums it up, why in the end the whole climate change topic really started to fly in the financial sector. It is because they started to realize that there is no such thing as business as usual. And I think before we had the Paris Accord, a lot of the people in finance, when they were asked why are you not doing more about sustainability, they were saying, well, I put my money in business as usual. I'm not an activist, I'm not an NGO, I'm not going to try to steer the world with my money. And so there was sort of like a do-nothing approach, which of course always is the easy approach, which meant that you were staying within the herd, within what your peers were doing, at the business as usual, so you don't need to move. And I think what the Paris Accord showed was the realization that this business as usual scenario is simply not there. So you have to make a choice. And the choice is between either, well, we do nothing in sense of an energy transition, and then we get into this scenario. But this is not a business as usual scenario. So climate changes, and that changes a lot. So we get what is called the physical risks. We go into a world where the global temperature will rise by 3 to 4 degrees. Very different world, no business as usual. However, if we go in the other side, and we do reach the objectives set in Paris, then the world will also change a lot, because then the economy needs to change a lot. So here we have the picture of this oil tanker, which is stranded in the desert, the stranded assets. And then, okay, we stay within a world which more or less has a business as usual temperature, but the economy is very different. And if you, as an investor, as a bank, are not prepared for this, do not know where your investments are, then you can get hurt pretty badly. Well, this sort of thinking, I think in the recent years has very quickly actually gained ground in the financial sector. So here are some quotes to illustrate that. And I think that the one I like best is this one from the Task Force on Climate Disclosures, who says that climate is one of the most significant and especially also most misunderstood risks for the financial sector, and that it's not only a long-term issue, but it can have significant near-term financial implications. And in DNB, the Dutch Central Bank, they have now said for the coming 5 years, climate is going to be one of our 3 top priorities. So it's really on the top of the agenda, thinking about climate like this way. So then the question is, here I may need some assistance. So what I wanted to say is here the question is, can we translate this kind of thinking also to the issue of natural capital and biodiversity? So, yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So can we say there is no such thing as business as usual when you get to biodiversity and natural capital? And I think we can, but I think where we are now is more or less where we were with climate about 5 years ago. So the case, so to say, really needs to be built. We need to develop the kind of scenarios that the financial sector will understand and will make them move. So on the one hand, the business as usual, in the sense we do not change our economy, well then the biosphere will change very much. So we can call this the bio-collapse scenario. But on the other hand, if we do have this revolution, I call it the circular revolution, illustrated here with a picture from artificial meat, then a lot of sectors, they will very much change. So if you have invested all your money in the raising of cows and cattle, then this trend will make sure that you will lose a lot of those the money invested there. So we have stranded assets in those kind of sectors. And so that's the kind of thinking I think we need to develop. And it's not much around at the moment, as far as I know. So this is an example that I particularly like. So it's from a research group from the Netherlands called Chain Reaction Research, who is looking particularly, very specifically, into deforestation and how that translates into financial risks. And there is this company, IOI Group, from Malaysia, who is a very big player in the palm oil production. This chain reaction research indicated that they were actually breaching the rules that were set by the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil Production. And they said if they keep on doing that, that's a big financial risk. Well, at that time, 2016, not many financial institutions took action based on this information. But what actually happened was that IOI was banned from the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil Production. And because of that, the big companies buying palm oil, like Nestle, like Unilever, didn't buy their products anymore. So their shares, they tumbled by almost 20%. They got a downgrade from the rating agencies, and a lot of financial investors lost money on this. And so I think it's quite a clear case on where, if you make the right analysis about how companies behave in terms of biodiversity, you can actually make sure that you lose less money, or the other way around, that you can make money. Well, this thinking, it starts to also land now with supervisors. So this is a recent report from the beginning of this year, again from the Netherlands, Dutch central banks, values at risk, in which they have looked at how the SDGs relate to financial risk. And for this, they also look to water scarcity and biodiversity loss. So it was a first broad research, but it starts them thinking, and I think this they will also take to the NGFS. So internationally, I think supervisors will start looking at this. Well, here more research from the Chain Reaction Research team, in which they introduced the words stranded land. So they take the thinking about the carbon bubble and translate that into a biodiversity or a forest bubble, if you like. How in this case in Indonesia, countries who own a lot of those lands and are valued as if they are going to be able to put palm oil on those lands, might actually not be able to do that and hence lose a lot of money. Well, other scenarios you can think of are, for instance, what happens with agriculture when all the pollinators are gone. As you probably know, there's a very fast reduction of the number of insects in the world and in Europe. What will that do to agriculture? These are the kind of scenarios I think we need to develop. Last example, in India, near Accra, there is a abandoned city. It's in the desert now, Fatehpur Sikri. So it was water scarcity that almost made the whole city empty. So how can that kind of thinking maybe lead to problems in other parts of the world, and how can that in the end have a financial impact? Well, I think that's all work that is still ahead of us to think about this, to bring this into focus. So let me conclude, summing up again. I think first of all, don't forget there are private financiers who are trying to do the right thing. And an important thing actually about this is that a lot of the regulation is making it hard for them now to do so. So I know the example of Triodos Bank, an originally Dutch bank, but it's active in many countries now, who are trying to set up impact funds, but are not allowed to let retail consumers invest in those. While those retail investors might actually want to have a positive impact through these kind of funds. When we look at supervision, currently in the Finance Watch paper, there's a strong emphasis on macro supervision, and rightly so, because I think a lot needs to happen there. But on the other hand, if you look at climate change, it also started with most analysis focused on macro. If you look where the action actually is on the micro part. So it's the central bank starting to ask questions to individual financial institutions, and that really starts to make those institutions do their homework, start to realize what the risks are, and therefore start to change the way they lend and invest their money. And so I would say be ambitious towards the supervisors. They can start, as they did with climate, by just identifying what are the best practices. But then I think quite quickly they should be able to translate this into the kind of like norms and guidance that they can give. Well, another part or another recommendation I saw in the Finance Watch report is that actually the Convention on Biodiversity should ask the NGFS to do something. Well, actually I think we still have a year to go. I would rather be a bit more ambitious and say, well, let's try to push the NGFS to push the convention to really deliver. Because I think that's what partly also helped getting to the Paris Accord, was that the financial sector was starting to recognize this problem and was actually saying, well, what we need is a smooth transition, and that means that we need to start quickly with it, that we have a long horizon of the kind of public policies we can expect. And that same logic, I think, we can also get from the financial sector towards this convention on biodiversity. Yeah, and then lastly, I talked about building these scenarios. I think that's the key thing now, to really raise the awareness in the financial sector on this issue. And where I started, remember, finance is complementary to public policies. They can sort of like strengthen them, be a leverage on that, but they are definitely not a replacement for that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rens.
Yeah, so we now have about 15 minutes for discussion with the audience. There's about 25 of you here and 30 online. I cannot believe there's not one question, because I've seen the registrations and I know there's many smart people but also involved in these processes. I'll kick off in case you're a bit shy, and so please, people online, also go to the YouTube chat room and leave questions. Yeah, I liked a lot of what you said. Something I liked in particular is this idea that you need to make people understand that there will be no business as usual, and that was a big accomplishment of on climate, whether it was specific to the Paris Accord or many other sort of work streams, having a synergy to reach that point. Of course, you said that's still a case to be made with biodiversity and natural capital. So I think absolutely that would be an important task over the next 12 months to make that case. And we do see, and then you alluded to transition risk and also physical risk. So I think that's where you need to make the case that indeed physical risk will be massive, but also with the political message that there will be a transition, so that basically you have to go for the transition risk, which is lower than the ultimate physical risk. I think all this is important because, and also we've seen this in Thomas' presentation, it's almost like we're getting close to this understanding that we need a transformation of our economy. If even the IPBES report now alludes to something about GDP and degrowth in some countries and growth only in some others. But we still probably see that politicians and decision makers are stuck with an old paradigm and a set of tools, and that for some reason they still don't see what's the alternative to that. So that you need these narratives about business and giving them a path, sort of a way out, which I think will be quite key over the last 12 to 18 months. Are there any questions here from the audience, or do we have questions online? I think we have a question online coming up. Yes.
Yeah, maybe more a remark than anything, but picking up again from the point about growth. I think so. One reason is employment, yes, but I think another point about politicians, they are just obsessed with the levels of debt, right? Public debt. And if you don't have growth, that means mathematically your ratio of debt will increase, and then the Commission will come to you, and then the ECB will be worried about your debt too. So you have, I think this is part of the problem, right? The obsession with debt. So, I mean, my remark would be simply, should we just have a debt jubilee and cancel this out? And what do you think, Rens?
I'm always in favor of a debt jubilee. No, so I mean, we do have a huge debt problem in Europe, and I think that forgiving a large part of those debts will someday be part of a solution to that. But that's really
well, degradation of the principle of precaution more operational in court and political proceedings.
Yes, I think there is. Actually, I took it out. I had a slide about Monsanto in my presentation, but I thought I need to shrink because I think it's very relevant as it is with climate. So the litigation argument, the fear for litigation, that's definitely one of the big risks. Yeah. So in any scenario that we're going to develop, we need to have an open eye for that as well.
So there's before we take another question in the audience here, there's a question online which is maybe a bit more technical, which is your views about ESG ratings and how they can play a role in this story of moving finance.
Yeah, I mean ESG ratings, if they work well, they are very important because they inform the investors about in this instance which company is doing better or worse in the field of biodiversity. I am actually rather skeptic often about the ESG ratings we have at the moment because they often do not measure what people actually think that they are measuring. I had to give an example of the car industry. I once saw a list of the different car companies, and the ones that had the best ESG ratings were also the ones who were actually selling cars with the biggest CO2 emissions. And that was simply because those cars makers like Mercedes, BMW, they had a long history of talking about this. So they had all kinds of policies, all kinds of disclosures, and you get a lot of points for that in the ESG ratings. And of course, you get a little bit less points because you don't sell too many electric cars. But that's sort of like more than evens out. Well, the car company on the bottom of the list was Tesla. Because it simply didn't report anything, which in itself is not a good thing. But at the same time, I think the ESG ratings, I think they need to improve to be really useful in this kind of things.
In our WWF work on finance, we've noticed investors on climate change first. Investors start to first worry about the climate-related financial risks for their own portfolio, which I call the selfish approach. Makes sense. They have fiduciary duties, etc. That's for their own portfolio and their own financial returns. And they start with this entry point, like the TCFDs, really on financial risks. And then gradually we see the leaders realize that this is not enough, and they move to caring about the impacts their own portfolios create on the real economy with emissions embedded in their portfolios, etc. And they start to realize that supporting Paris-aligned scenarios is the best way forward for them, because this is both the lowest risk scenarios and the highest return scenarios economically and financially. But they start with financial risk, and then they realize they need to move to impacts that their own financial activities create on the economy. Do you make this distinction in your work or not? Because in our view, that's really two different chapels that have to be addressed differently. Some investors only care about the climate-related value at risk. Other investors start to care about the degree of alignment of their portfolios with the Paris Agreement, which is not the financial risk approach, but more, let's say, the normative approach, and how much they will align, they will contribute actively to achieving public policy goals on the environment, on the on the SDGs, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial point. I left it actually out of my presentation because I think that's very much where the discussion on the climate side currently is. And so therefore we're not there yet with biodiversity, but hopefully we'll get to that point quite soon. So the focus from just trying to avoid risks for your own portfolio versus having more of what I would call a systemic view. And trying to think how you can make sure that the system as a whole doesn't go into the wrong direction. What you see, I've written an article about this in Responsible Investor a year ago, and that was because there was a so-called responsible product from an asset manager who said we did our homework, we looked at the climate risks, and we found out that the physical risks are very high in Southeast Asia. So our responsible fund does not invest in Southeast Asia, which from this micro perspective, from your own portfolio, it's probably a wise thing to do. But on the other hand, if we think globally, we want to avoid climate change, where do the investments actually need to be made? That's in Southeast Asia, because people are moving towards the cities there. That's where we're going to build in the next 10, 20 years all the infrastructure, which in the end will decide whether as a world we'll be able to stay within a 2-degree world, or we go way over those limits. I think there's a big question: how are we going to bring more investors to the level that they really care about the systemic view? At the same time, I'm quite skeptical, because I do see there's also in the Netherlands a few that actually take that viewpoint now. But in the end, they will have to compete in a market that will make it hard for them. So actually, my hope is much more on the NGFS in that sense. So central bankers amongst each other to recognize this systemic problem and see that they are probably the only ones who can solve this.
Thank you. There's another question online, which I will mention in a second. Also, Thomas, if you're still online and you want to jump in or have a final comment as the session comes to a close in about 6 or 7 minutes. So the question online from a familiar foe is mentioning the fact that central banks and supervisors have been able to move recently on climate because there's data. There's this sort of simple one indicator which applies all over the planet, which is possibly the ton of CO2. And so, yes, potentially they would turn to us saying, well, that's all nice, that we need, Finance Watch and others call us to extend our scope to nature risk and dependencies and impact, but what sort of data can we use? What sort of indicators are out there? What would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that in the end very much depends on the kind of scenarios that we're actually going to think of, because from those scenarios you will see what kind of data you need to know where you are in that scenario. And of course CO2 emissions, that's something you can measure, so it's quite clear. You can make a carbon footprint, and it's good that it's there and it's being used. And at the same time, also in terms of climate risk, it doesn't tell you so very much, because it doesn't tell you anything about the future. So if you are going to compare, for instance, two car companies, they can both have the same CO2 emissions currently, but if one is investing all its money in electric companies, electric cars, while the other one is just investing in bigger combustion engine cars, then they have a very different risk view. So I think also in climate there still is a lot of development still going on in the kind of indicators that we can really use in making the risk assessment, and in biodiversity we just simply have to catch up on that.
Yeah, but it is a much more complex area, so that's I think it is indeed a good question, because it could be a key barrier to having sort of the big picture macro policy, like at central bank level, start to take action. Thomas, do you want to come in or react to some of the things that have been said?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, and I agree with your message. And just want to comment on the last question, the previous
Please.
Question on transformation. I think we will see transformations in both land use, agriculture, forestry, and fishing, for example. And of course, we see a transformation already in the electricity system, and we will see a transformation in the industry system. But I think for the financial system will need to change the short-termism of incentives for how people working in the financial system, they get incentives for acting in a very short-sighted way. But there is too much attention to voluntary things like ESGs and green bonds and these things. I think the potential of these voluntary things is very small. There needs to be transformational changes in the financial sector, I don't know exactly how to regulate. That's not my expertise. But of course, we must make sure that the financial system is serving the economy and the biosphere, and also serving people and equality. And now I think it fails to serve anything of these. It doesn't even serve the economy, and does not serve equity either. So the problems that were mentioned by the audience is that we have seen growth in many European countries, but we have still not seen reduction in inequalities. And the same thing in the US, of course. All the growth has been gone to the richest 10-20%. So we have a failure of the financial system. And of course, it has to do with taxes, and it has to do with the regulations of the financial sector. And I think what we see now is that the end of the neoliberal era. We had neoliberalism since 1980, since Thatcher and Reagan. And now I think it survived the financial crisis, 2008. But I think now it's actually on the defeat. And the bad news is that it's defeated mainly by the right wing, by the populists who are against free trade and are against much of the neoliberal policies by Macron and by other people. And I think we need to have a new social contract when the progressive people like ourselves, it can also be finding a way how to defeat both this bad outcomes of neoliberalism, the outcomes of surpassing the planetary boundaries and biodiversity and inequalities. At the same time, we have to fight the right wing, because they have very cheap ways, very cheap solutions. They're blaming the immigrants, and they're blaming, I don't know what to blame, the homosexuals, whatever. They find anything they can blame. And of course, we don't find a solution in that. So instead of having just one fighting the bad outcomes of neoliberalism, now we have to fight both of these, the neoliberalism and the right wing. So I think we have to see this struggle with the financial sector within this kind of double fighting, which means that we have to find ways to listen to the people who are this yellow vests in France, and all the people who feel that they're losers in the green economy, they're losers in the climate change, politics, etc. We have to listen to them, because otherwise they will turn and vote for the right wing, and then we will not solve our problems. So we need to combine more, to understand the rural development people who feel left out of, for example, Macron's politics, which is quite neoliberal. And even in Sweden, we have protests against petrol prices right now. 300,000 people protesting against rising petrol prices. And I think we have to have a dialogue with these people, because otherwise they will all become voting for the right wing. Thank you.
So this wasn't actually planned, but that's a very nice transition to the second session. I think you brought us in sort of the political space, which might be a bit more uncomfortable, but I do think you're right. In the second session, so we'll have a 15 minutes coffee break right now. In the second session, we will discuss opportunities, including the COP15 of CBD, of course, in about 18 months. And I do think Thomas made a good point that both sort of what you call neoliberal, which would be sort of the politics of the status quo, believing that's possible, or the sort of reaction we see in different countries, like in Brazil or the US, for example. I think we can be pretty sure that with both approach, we wouldn't reach any sort of ambition at the COP15 of CBD next year, so that we need to build a different story or find a third way. So 15 minutes break. I'm very impressed. It's probably testimony to the quality of our speakers and the discussion that we still have the same number of people online now at the end of the session than at the beginning. You really want to stay for the second session, where we look at the opportunities to push this sort of ambitious transformative change that's been alluded to into the political scene, and opportunities for that. We're very lucky to have Markus Lehmann from the Secretariat of CBD, so he's actually in charge of the economic unit, so co-drafting some of the text that will be there in terms of resource mobilization, it's called, but so finance particularly. How can finance serve this restoration of nature? And then Jason Ace, who has a specific mandate over the last few weeks with this consultancy to look at the bigger picture around this issue and the different strategies and actors to push this debate forward. So please stay with us. We'll start back sharp at 3:45, so that's in a bit less than 15 minutes. So thanks a lot, and see you then. Yes, Markus, we'll be with you in a second. We're setting up here, but we can hear you now.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, very good.
Okay. So I have your presentation here, Markus. So let me know when I need to flip slides, but you will be on the live stream just in a second. So Markus, we're delighted to have you. We had a first session where we focused more on the concepts and strategy. So what would be an ambitious agenda to make finance serve nature, as we called it, which is, as you know, about moving mainstream flows to, first of all, as one of the last questions we didn't manage to pick up in the first session was, how do you immediately start divesting from these activities who are still destroying biodiversity, and then of course how do you move these flows, these flawed flows, into a different type of economy that helps to restore and conserve ecosystems. So now this session with you and Jason is about, first with you, the opportunity of CBD to push for this agenda, and I think you will explain that. You are the head of the economic policy unit at the CBD Secretariat. Markus was also involved in the work of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the TEEB initiative. Some of you might know it from a few years ago, which really started this understanding of the links between the economy and biodiversity. So Markus, the floor is yours for about 15-20 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Benoit, and thanks for inviting me, and good afternoon to all of you. When I discussed my presentation with Benoit before, I was given to understand that perhaps not all of you are familiar with the convention. So I thought I should kick off my presentation by giving you a very quick overview, and that would be my first slide. I hope you can all see that on the screen now. Now the CBD, as many of you might know, is one of the three Rio Conventions signed in 1992 at the Rio Conference in Brazil. It entered into force in 1993, and we have currently 196 parties, that is 195 states, and one regional organization, the European Union. I frequently refer to the conference of the parties and their meetings and their decisions, and of course that's the governing body of the supreme governing body of the convention. We also have two protocols under the convention. The protocol on biosafety entered into force in 2003, and the protocol on the Nagoya Protocol on the third objective of the convention on the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, and that entered into force in 2014. Now, the three main objectives are the conservation of sustainable on biodiversity, but also the sustainable use of its components, and as I mentioned, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Now, in order to give further momentum, and with that I move to the next slide, please, to give further momentum to the implementation of the convention, we have the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020, adopted in Nagoya, Japan in October 2010. Importantly, that's not just a CBD framework, but it was recognized by the UN as a whole to be the global framework for biodiversity. So that includes biodiversity-related conventions and other partners. We have these 20 IG biodiversity targets grouped under 5 strategic goals. And importantly, for our discussion on resource mobilization, one of the 5 strategic goals is to mainstream biodiversity across government and society. And in so doing, this goal links biodiversity, the realm of natural science, if you may, to economics and human well-being, the realm of social science and economics. And of course, the kind of the bridging concept between these two realms is referenced in the mission of the strategic plan. And that's basically the fact that healthy ecosystems and underpinning biodiversity provide ecosystem services which are essential for socio-economic development and human well-being more generally. Now, if you look at specifically at the resource mobilization framework under the current strategic plan, we can see that we actually have quite some acquis of decisions, associated guidance, etc., associated with resource mobilization. So, of course, underlying all of this is CBD Article 20. But then we have in the strategic plan IT Target 20, which talks about the aim to substantially increase the mobilization of financial resources for implementation of the strategic plan. IT Target 20 also makes reference to the existing strategy for resource mobilization, and I come back to it in a moment. The strategy for resource mobilization, which is kind of tagged to this, tied to the strategic plan, is very broad, and in order to give further focus, the COP at a subsequent meeting at COP12 adopted target for resource mobilization. And two of them actually become pretty famous for their substance, in particular the target to double international biodiversity finance flows to developing countries by 2015, and the target to mobilize domestic financial resources from all sources. But there's also a number of, if you may, more process-oriented targets, which are also put on the slide here, and which mirror closely then the methodology of our main implementation partner, the UNDP Biofit Initiative. So next slide, please. Now, I mentioned the strategy for resource mobilization, which actually had been adopted by COP9 already. And I wanted to emphasize one element. As I said, the strategy is very broad, address all kinds of sources, public, private financing, etc. But there's also a specific goal on what was perceived back then as new and innovative financial mechanisms. And that's quite interesting because it mirrors or foreshadows, if you may, a couple of funding sources which have now increasingly moved to the forefront of the discussion and of the attention of relevant stakeholders. So that's in particular with regard, of course, with regard to new innovative sources of international development finance, climate finance. If you think about the success of RED Plus schemes or the establishment of the GCF, but it's also related to markets for green products. If you think about product and progress certifications, with biodiversity partnerships, if you think about private or blended finance, etc., or if you think about impact investments in terms of new forms of charity. Now, as Benoit mentioned, your discussion you were having about kind of divesting from activities which are harmful for biodiversity. I wanted to mention also that there is close linkages to Aichi biodiversity target incentive measures, which specifically talks about taking action on harmful subsidies by 2020. And if you think about that, recent OECD data point to environmentally or biodiversity harmful subsidies globally ranging in the amount of 500 billion US dollars per year, you can understand that there is certainly a lot of opportunities for action here. Now, to report progress against targets for resource mobilization I mentioned earlier, the parties also adopted a financial reporting framework, and I will refer back to them. That framework and the results we were getting from the reports submitted by parties throughout my presentation. Now, in terms of implementation support, I mentioned already the UNDP Biofit initiative, and I have to interrupt for technical reasons. Sorry, I have an awful echo. I hear myself very loudly with the 1 second delay. It's very difficult to focus on. If you can do something about that, that will really be great. Let me try. Yeah, this is way better. No, it's still there. It's just the echo is longer. Anyways, please try to do something about it, and I will try to continue to plough on. But it's really very difficult to focus when you hear yourself all the time, very loudly in your earphones. Now, in terms of implementation, UNDP Biofit Initiative, with currently 39 countries directly supported, and all eligible countries and interested countries supported what they were called regional nodes, dedicated regional advisors to provide tailored advice on resource mobilization and use of the biofin methodology to basically all eligible developing countries. Now the echo is gone. This is way better. Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, we also had a high-level panel on resource mobilization, which was specifically tasked to come up with an assessment of the financial resources needed for implementation of the strategic plan. It delivered 2 reports, and I will come back to some of the results. We had a range of dialogue workshops on contentious issues surrounding, let's say, financing instruments which rely on markets like payments for ecosystem services. That was co-organized with SvetBio. We had a range of capacity building activities, regional, sub-regional workshops on resource mobilization and financial reporting, co-organized with UNDP Biofin. We have currently, for instance, a massive open online course on biodiversity finance run by the initiative, and you find further information under that link there. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of implementation progress, generally speaking, well, we made quite some progress if you look at progress against the targets for resource mobilization, but it's clearly overall insufficient to address the overall biodiversity finance gap that has even been calculated under the current strategic plan. So in terms of the progress, we can see from the financial reports, but also from OECD DAC data, that the doubling target to double biodiversity flows to developing countries by 2015 against a deadline or against a reference of the average between 2006 and 2010. That has essentially been met by OECD DAC members for 2015. Now, there is an element of the target that says, and maintain that level until 2020. So for that, the jury is still out. But for 2015, it has essentially been met. In terms of domestic finance, it's also positive to see that the majority of reporting parties report actually an increasing trend in biodiversity expenditures. And then, of course, we have methodological and also some substantial progress in biodiversity finance planning through the Biofin initiative, with the majority of the 39 Biofin countries now moving towards finalizing their finance plan and actually moving towards the implementation stage. Well, the progress is overall insufficient because if you look at the latest OECD data and OECD assessments, we have roughly in the amount of close to 50 billion annually coming from public finance. That's based on the financial report submitted to the convention. And then we have another figure, which is basically an equal amount, which is a blend of private finance tools and market-driven instruments. You cannot add up the two figures because of overlapping and inconsistent methodologies, so that you would risk double counting. But perhaps by a rule of a thumb, some guesstimate, you might think that by existing biodiversity financing is in the amount of 80 or so billion perhaps annually, whereas the funding need, according to the calculations made by the high-level panel, is in the amount of conservatively at least 150 billion, and then depending on the assumptions that you make in terms of synergies between the IG targets, etc., it can go up to even 440 billion. So of course, from 150 to 440 billion, there's quite a range. It points to, generally speaking, we do not have very good methodologies for doing these types of assessments. But we can also note that with the financial reporting being undertaken, with the OECD DAC data being refined, we are data-wise perhaps in a better position than we were 10 years ago. Now, this is basically the acquis where we stand now. But as you know, the strategic plan is going to expire, and the last COP in Egypt last winter now established a process towards developing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. What the relevant decision of the COP does is to establish a dedicated open-ended working group for undertaking their task. It will meet at least twice throughout the next 2 years. And the whole process is really under the leadership of the two co-chairs of the open-ended working group, and will be overseen by the COP Bureau and the other subsidiary bodies of the convention. So the SubStar, the technical body, SBI, the subsidiary body on implementation, and the working group on Article 8J, which deals with traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices. They shall be mutually supportive, and of course, the details will be hammered out during the process. In fact, are being hammered out right now as we talk. So the two co-chairs are from Uganda and from Canada, achieving geographical balance north-south. And the co-chairs, as I say, they steer the overall process and have to ensure coherence and complementarity with the other international processes, in particular, the linkage to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As you know, we have basically the two SDGs which are directly linked to biodiversity. That's 14 and 15, life on land and life underwater. But then, of course, we have biodiversity-related targets, which were in fact inspired in a number of cases by the relevant IG targets in a number of other SDGs, and basically just pointing, as I mentioned earlier, to the fact that biodiversity, ecosystem health, ecosystem services contribute to the achievement of many of the other SDGs. We have a set of overarching guiding principles for the process, which are mapped out in the decision. And we have now consultations being rolled out through online forums and regional consultations. In fact, we have the first round of regional consultations is now being almost wrapped up, with one meeting in Latin America still to be done. If I could see exactly. So the process will essentially go in 2 phases. We are now in phase 1, gathering views, identifying issues. As I mentioned, the regional consultations are almost finalized, but then we also have a kind of a process where everyone can submit views on the scope, on the substance of the post-2020 framework. We just finalized the second round with an updated discussion paper from the two co-chairs being released early. And then it will basically further structure the subsequent process. In addition to the meetings of the open-ended working group, we have, of course, a couple of relevant meetings where post-2020 target will, the post-2020 framework will also play a role. IPBES, as you know, just concluded last week. And then, of course, we have these other meetings I mentioned here. Phase 2 will more like move into different thematic issues with various formats possible. Typically, might be a thematic consultative workshops, but it's there that we can also use other existing processes, and we don't necessarily need to duplicate everything under the CBD. And the final phase then will bring these different FEDs together. That will likely happen at around summer 2020. Substar 24 and SBI 3 will be important steps, and then presumably we will have another meeting of the open-ended working group, and that will bring the threads together, as I said, and bring it to COP15. Now, specifically on the resource mobilization component, the pertinent decision says that resource mobilization is to be an integral part of the post-2020 framework, and that also the preparations need to be initiated at an early stage and in full coherence and coordination with the overall process. And that in some, to some extent, reflects also a kind of certain degree of dissatisfaction with how it happens the last time, whereas, you know, the targets for resource mobilization were actually adopted only when we were almost halfway through the decade. Now, in order to structure or to support that process, the Executive Secretary is to contract a panel of 3 to 5 experts, and we are currently in the process of doing that. The panel shall have balanced geographical representation, and basically the panel will have 3 different tasks. First, ex post, an ex post assessment, review the experiences of achieving Aichi Biodiversity Target 20 and the strategy for resource mobilization. Then second, undertaking another costing exercise, estimate the resources needed for different scenarios of implementing the post-2020 framework, so that gives us some wiggle room of what we might have in the post-2020 framework. And last but not least, develop a draft resource mobilization component for the post-2020 framework. And that work of the experts will be considered by the open-ended working group, and then ultimately by COP15. So given the tasks at hand, we contemplate that the work of the experts can be staggered. In principle, the first task I mentioned on the reviewing the experiences with the current framework, that can in principle start immediately. But for the other 2, for the costing and for developing the draft resource mobilization component, the experts will obviously need to have at least some idea on the scope and content of the post-2020 framework. We can, of course, use the existing assessment as a starting point, given that there seems to be general agreement that use the existing strategic plan and the Aichi targets as a starting point for the further work on the post-2020 framework. But we certainly will have need to have some more information coming from parties and from the overall process. So in that sense, as I mentioned, we could foresee some of the tasks being undertaken or started earlier than others. As per our current planning, but please bear in mind that there's still a lot of moving parts in the calendar, and that might very well change. But we foresee a need for a thematic consultative workshop on resource mobilization in 2020 to be confirmed. But that workshop would certainly bring broader party representation and, of course, relevant stakeholders, relevant organizations and initiatives to have basically a first look at the work of the experts before the work goes to the open-ended working group for its consideration. We already put it on the agenda of SBI 3, which will happen in early summer 2020. Simply because SBI 3 has always been tasked with the resource mobilization work, so there's some specific expertise there. And it might create another stepping stone before it is considered by the open-ended working group. In closing, and that's in fact my second to last slide. No, please, yeah, exactly. I wanted to mention, I mean, obviously, and your workshop today is testimony to this. There is considerable interest in the resource mobilization agenda as related to the post-2020 framework. And that means that there are a number of initiatives already ongoing or close to be launched or about to be launched. I mentioned just a few here. That's the work of our implementation partner, UNDP Biofin, together with Global Canopy, to update the little pink book for the veterans in matters biodiversity among you. You will recall that the Global Canopy issued that little pink book. It was pink, and the pink was also an acronym standing for Proactive Investment in Natural Capital. And it provided back then at COP10 a very nice overview of where we stand in terms of biodiversity financing, with very nice presentations, infographics, etc. So that's about to be updated. There is, of course, the work of the OECD for the G7 presidency. I just mentioned their latest release, their latest report on resource mobilization. Then the Campaign for Nature, for instance, is undertaking also a needs assessment of their 30 by 30 goal. Now, whether the 30 by 30 goal and to what extent will be reflected in post-2020 remains obviously to be seen, but there is certainly here be an interesting link through the methodology being used for the financial needs assessment. And there might be more. I mean, of course, the broader initiatives to come up with kind of Stern-like reports, really kind of basically a TEEP 2 that's also in the works by the WEF, for instance, or by the government of the United Kingdom under the leadership of Partha Dasgupta. So these broader reports on the economic or business case certainly indirectly also relate to the resource mobilization work. I'm mentioning this because all these different work streams, I think, have significant opportunities for, as I put it here, certainly for harmonizing timelines amongst themselves, but also with the CBD process. As I mapped out the calendar on my previous slide, I mean, there are critical entry points or kind of intermediate steps where provisional or the first results of the experts would be delivered to the process. So I would think it would be very nice for these other initiatives if they were reflected there. But in order to do that, we would need to at least achieve a timely sharing of results, if not kind of broader collaboration. In the Secretariat, we are currently thinking about how to best structure this, or kind of, how do you say, harness these opportunities, perhaps by calling a group together. So, but on that, please stay tuned. That's not yet decided. So, with that, just perhaps my last slide, some further reading, some links which you might peruse if you want to look at the precise language. That's on the last slide, please. And that basically concludes my talk. And of course, I stand ready for any questions you might have, and I look forward to the discussion. And of course, to my co-referee.
Basically, we need to switch from Zoom to Skype, and so we couldn't have both speakers. So that's why Jason also. I hope he's back online, but that's why, Markus, you've been cut. So sorry for the technical issues and the small delay. I'd like to take a few questions now about your presentation. So thanks a lot for outlining the CBD process, which obviously includes some level of complexity, specifically on resource mobilization. I think the good news, as you put it, is that resource mobilization is immediately to be an integral part of the reviewed strategy as of 2020, where it was late in the last strategy. So I suppose that's good news. You said there's an ongoing assessment of the results of the previous strategy. Maybe I missed the timeline when it comes to that. So that you have a small expert group of 5 people, I understand, which will be conducting these 3 tasks. Did you mention when they will release their initial results, or will those results be public?
Yes, I mean, as I said, the group itself is not yet established. It has to do with the fact that we are still finalizing funding arrangements. And then once these are finalized, we can move ahead with getting them on board, basically. Now, the work is supposed to be undertaken in the second half of this year. Of course, we will use existing opportunities, for instance, meeting of the open-ended working group, other meetings related to the post-2020 process, to bring preliminary results from the experts to the broader process. But a first stepping stone where we really foresee kind of releasing preliminary results for first round of discussions would be at the thematic workshop, which we contemplate taking place in early 2020. And then based on that, updated reports of the experts would go to SBI 3 and to a meeting of the open-ended working group. Now, the calendar for the open-ended working group is still shaping up. The first meeting will taking place end of August in Nairobi. But that will be very early to present really any specific results coming from the work of the experts. So my sense is that the work on resource mobilization would come later in the process, as I mentioned. Hello?
Yeah, you are back now, sorry.
Okay. So did you lose me in the meantime?
We missed the end, so if you can wrap up your conclusion as to the response to my question, that would be great, because we missed the very end.
Well, I just mapped out the time.
Okay.
He said that the precise calendar for the meeting of the open group is still being worked. The meeting will take place end of August in Nairobi. But for the resource mobilization work, early present results. So I mentioned the results of the work, or the intermediate stages, so to say, will go through the thematic consultations in early 2020, and subsequent to SBI 3 and meeting of the open-ended working group in 2020.
Thank you. Do we have questions in the audience following Markus' presentation? Or
Now I'm not hearing you.
I don't see any question. Can you hear me, Markus, now? The technical issue is that we switch from Zoom to Skype, and I think when we have the two in parallels, then the connection becomes really bad. But we can hear you now. I think I'm not sure you'll be you'll be happy to respond to this question, but I think that a big question is can the CBD in 2020 achieve some sort of similar success to the COP in Paris in terms of, as we discussed in the first session, this setting a high political ambition when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystem services of a similar level than was achieved in Paris, and what would be needed to do that. So I know it's a very broad question. I have one or two ideas of the response, but yeah, how can we help to make that happen?
It is a different question indeed. I mean, the ambition is certainly there, but ultimately it will depend on the negotiations among the governments, among the parties. Now, I know that the ambition is there on the side of many parties, but then how the negotiation dynamics pan out, that's difficult to forecast, so to say. And I mean, mind you that there's also this fine line between professional optimism on the one hand, but then you can also kind of fall track to victim to your own ambition if the final political result and what is political achievement falls back. I think in terms of resource mobilization, the good message is that we are significantly more advanced methodologically in a couple of things. And this is why I mentioned these innovative tools that are mapped in the current strategic for resource mobilization going back to 2008. I think we are significantly more advanced in terms of, for instance, private financing for environmental purposes or blended finance tools. I'm not quite sure that we are as advanced in biodiversity than as other fields like climate finance or water-related finance. But my sense is there are significant opportunities there to scale that further. And then, of course, in terms of the sheer financial planning, what you might call an element of budgetary mainstreaming in so far as we talk about public finance. We are also significantly more advanced in the work of the UNDP Biofuel Initiative. So this is all, I think, very good news for coming up with a strong resource mobilization component for post-2020. And yes, I mean, that certainly support moving towards a Paris moment at COP.
We'll all be hoping for that, but also making sure we put all the pressure we can from outside the tent, if I may say, to make sure it happens. Now, I hope Jason, you're with us. I know you couldn't hear everything because of the switch, but you had seen the presentation from Markus. Markus, if you can stay with us for another 25-30 minutes, it would be great, so you can maybe intervene at a later stage. So we'll see now if Jason is with us on Zoom. So what Jason will do now is broaden a bit the scope in terms of the various opportunities that are out there. It's going to take 2 minutes beyond the CBD process, so either in parallel or beyond that horizon, because we do understand there are political constraints related to CBD. But so Jason will draw a bigger picture of actors who are busy in the field and the different strategies they are using, as I said, inside or outside the tent. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Berkeley in California and a Bachelor of Arts from the Yale University, worked at McKinsey & Co. and created a consultancy called Vivid Economics, who's been over the last few weeks mapping out precisely the different strategies in the field and how they could be more supported to have an impact either on CBD or just on this agenda of the link between finance and biodiversity. going forward. And I hope Jason will be with us soon. If there's a question from the audience in the meantime, here in Brussels or online, do not hesitate.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Jason, I think you're with us with the sound anyway. Oh, wonderful. Okay, let's see.
Excellent. Very
Okay.
good.
So Jason,
Thank you.
I just introduced you. I know you missed some of Markus' speech. I'm really sorry about that. But you had seen the slides and you might be familiar with the CBD process. So we heard all about that. We landed with the big question. You know, can we get a sort of Paris moment in China in 2020? And so I think right now we'll put that aside a bit maybe, and you can give us maybe your view on the bigger picture of opportunities to push an ambitious finance for nature agenda, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. So you have about 15 minutes or so, and so the floor is yours. Thanks, Jason.
Sure, very good. Thanks a lot, and good afternoon to everyone. I do apologize ahead of time. I did miss the previous speaker, so hopefully I won't repeat anything that they said. Great. So what I wanted to go through a little bit on the back of some work that Vivid has done with MAVA over the last month or so, looking at the kind of current landscape of initiatives and programs helping to push forward and support the biodiversity finance nexus, and use that as a way of reflecting on areas of progress, areas of gaps, and hopefully focusing on complementing what Markus has talked about on what's happening with CBD to try to look a little bit more broadly across the landscape, and think of that in terms of a complement in a way to CBD. So here I go. I guess in broad terms, what we did, just so people understand the exercise, is we did an interview and desk-based review of some of the major initiatives focused on the biodiversity and finance nexus. We interviewed over 30 people from various NGOs, IOs, academic experts, and the private sector. By doing that, we sought to map out these initiatives. As I said, it's not necessarily a comprehensive review in that we talked to or uncovered everything that's going on, but the aim was to really at least get a gauge of where the balance of effort is, where some of the gaps are, and what it might mean around the CBD process. So a bit of a disclaimer in that there's certainly things that we wouldn't have seen, and not everything I'll point out may be perfect, but I hope it gives a good overview of where the landscape is more broadly. So what we did to try to understand things going on is we sort of tagged the major activities and initiatives around three main dimensions. One are the actually actors and their kind of actions. So those who are influencing biodiversity and finance and the kind of things they can do to influence it. And there we broadly looked across the financial institutions themselves, governments that influence, of course, the environment in which financial institutions act, and citizens and individuals who are, of course, consumers, savers, and to some degree voters. We looked at the kind of actors and actions being addressed. We then looked at some of the what we're calling biodiversity and finance wedges. So that is what areas, what types of finance, equity, debt, loans, insurance, and liabilities, what type of biodiversity preservation or destruction drivers are they looking at? So protected areas and restoration, agricultural or fishing sustainability or unsustainability, pollution, diets. What are the focuses in terms of those wedges? And finally, we looked at the initiatives that are out there to try to understand what specific activities they're focused on. So from a range, starting with things like knowledge and metrics development, through to the adaptation of standards and various ways of certification at a project or transaction level, through to piloting specific actions, through to advocating for action, either directly financial institutions or or through government, and things like coordinating and networking activities. So we tried to tag initiatives around who they're focused on in terms of the actors and their actions, what areas of biodiversity and finance in terms of the core content, what do they actually do. And so that was the space that we tried to map out. And what we found, I think, is insightful, if, as I said before, not necessarily fully comprehensive. So I'm going to frame it a little bit, starting from an actor's lens. I think for the financial sector, there has been, and there seems to be, quite a lot of energy and initiative focused on progressing the underlying knowledge development and the data and metrics that can help steer activity. It's obviously a complex problem, biodiversity, multidimensional in the way that in some ways climate mitigation isn't. And a good deal of effort has been focused on building out the metrics and understanding of what biodiversity is and how you understand where it's impacted. And a lot of that, I think, was probably emphasized earlier, has been developed out along with as part of the CBD process itself. And so we've seen a lot of initiatives that are trying to get that knowledge base right. We've seen a lot of that applied to finance, for the financial sector, in terms of trying to understand the link to underlying risk and return, largely in the vein of sort of natural capital, where the aim is to really see how biodiversity might be incorporated into project level fiduciary criteria and things like that. So really, from a financial sector lens, there's been a number of efforts that probably mentioned earlier that really try to understand how to take that through underlying and return. There has been some effort to pulling that through to the whole field of impact investment or avoiding damage investment, let's call it. So there are a number of efforts to understand what metrics are actually suitable at a transaction level to steer impact investing or to help steer away from creating damage. But much of that focus remains around climate-related indicators. So when you start to move from the knowledge base that the financial sector is working off of to the actual metrics they might use at a transaction level, you tend to see biodiversity dropping away and being and where it's more often used, or what the more often used indicators are more closely related to climate, things like deforestation with a very climate mitigation or carbon emissions lens. They're also, when it gets to that level, more often focused on impact or measuring positive impact than avoiding damage right now. So there's a certain, when it comes to what initiatives there are with and in the financial sector, you start to see as it moves to actual transaction decisions, it sort of gets less, there's less of it. And that goes also for a lot of pilot efforts. People will be familiar with various institutions that are in countries trying to push pilots, investments, projects around confronting drivers of biodiversity loss. But very, very much the focus remains on climate change without a very sharp or clear biodiversity lens. So there's an interesting, I think what at least we've seen out there is a lot of knowledge development and a lot of good focus on understanding what the problem is and getting metrics that investors can use to think strategically, less grounding it in stuff that's usable for transactions, except to the extent it interfaces quite a lot with climate change. Then, in terms of a lens that looks more at what's going on and what initiatives are thinking about government's role, there's obviously the full program of CBD, which I won't try to outline since you've already talked through it, and there is international coordination across a number of targets and the supporting activities for those targets. When it comes to sort of efforts that are potentially targeted more at a local or national level, again, the knowledge base and the metrics have been developed and are there for at least strategic conversations about what role the government can play in thinking about biodiversity, in how how biodiversity gets taken into account with regards to finance. And there is, I think, around that initiatives that focus on lending activities, particularly to oriented towards protecting nature. But I think in the government, in the space which is around the government's potential role, its role in policy that would unlock investment, its role in perhaps being a direct investor or a direct procurer of certain products and services, or its role as a financial regulator. There's less direct focus with a very strong biodiversity lens. So there's only sporadic sort of national efforts that are trying to push specific policy approaches that might, for example, integrate biodiversity into incentive-oriented policies. There's a lot on climate, and where climate interfaces with biodiversity, of course, that's a nice spillover effect, but very, very biodiversity-oriented initiatives trying to push specific policies remain relatively sparse outside the international process. And then when it comes to the areas of action for which there are initiatives, a lot of the focus is on regulations and policies that protect nature or put in incentive mechanisms directly for finance and payment for ecosystem services and things. There's far fewer initiatives that look at the other roles of government in terms of establishing statutory liabilities, direct government procurement, or broader financial regulations, as regards biodiversity in particular. So that's the second sort of lens, and the final lens with regards to citizen-related action is probably broadly similar to government and maybe even more in a way nascent. There's lots of knowledge development activities that are informing consumer-led or citizen-led thinking. There are obviously efforts on the consumer demand side of things, but that's a step away in some ways from the actual financing itself. But consumer demand for products that aren't who aren't aligned with biodiversity outcomes, and there are certain initiatives that are focused on trying to mobilize citizens for advocacy. But in terms of the role of citizens that we've seen in other aspects like climate change, as savers who are channeling and helping channeling money into investments that are of a biodiversity lens, or even legal action, it remains relatively sparse and scattered. So where do we? That's meant to give you an overall picture. Where do we start to think about what this means, and what is the kind of a broader perspective on it? I think probably a first conclusion, which will be obvious probably to everyone on the line, is that even though there's a balance of effort that's a bit more in some areas and less in others, at least from what we were able to map out, on all fronts, the amount of effort is drastically insufficient, right? So in terms of the amounts of effort being put to the nexus of biodiversity and finance and trying to help make sure that the financial system and the transactions that are feeding economic activity are aligned with biodiversity, even in areas where there is relatively more focus. It seems clear that the CBD process has been pushing, a slow but steady buildup of a comprehensive international framework where finance is incorporated. It also seems clear that a lot of what you see in the overall ecosystem is influenced by that. So whether it's a direct part of the CBD process, or whether it's a sort of a companion to it or spillover from it, that remains in some ways the core show. On the one hand, that's there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's a lot of CBD has been a solidly thought through effort trying to broadly engage, and to the extent that its initiatives and targets have supported action, those have good effects across the system, even at a more bottom-up local and national level, so none of that's necessarily wasted. On the other hand, I think if you look at the broader space, there's a sense there isn't yet necessarily a full enough set of plan Bs, if I could put it that way, initiatives that that might be able to make sure we still make progress if international efforts under deliver, and it might push more broadly, slightly more bottom up, perhaps. I think another sort of more broad impression from the review we did is that current efforts are quite fragmented. A lot of things are covered. I mean, there's certainly many people who are trying to push this, but they're not well connected. This isn't necessarily about consolidating, but there seems to be more that can be done to coordinate and connect activities across the space. Quite a lot of people, whether in different regions or focused on different aspects, different activities, or different actors, were surprisingly sort of isolated in how they were doing things, and so there seems to be potential there to be drawing together some of these additional initiatives. So then I guess the role of our piece of work wasn't to drive definitive recommendations per se, but I guess maybe as my closing remarks, it is I think useful to maybe step back and say, well, do we see something outside of the CBD? What are the areas maybe outside of the CBD process for which more effort could be impactfully focused? And so I think there's one set which is just simply kind of plugging some of the specific gaps that came out of what I was just discussing. Better connecting action across government, citizens, and the financing efforts. Understanding that progress requires both kind of supply and demand to work together. That is to say, supply of finance, but also the underlying demand oriented towards preserving biodiversity. And it's not always necessarily sufficient to, well, it's never going to be sufficient to focus on one or the other. So there's a certain gap, I think, in perhaps connecting more thoroughly, but also as I highlighted above, there's specific gaps where we just don't see as much effort. There's probably fewer direct engagement on the government side and its role. There's not as much on liabilities as there is in things like lending and maybe even equity. There's not efforts at this stage on things like financial regulation, which we've seen getting pushed very hard in climate change lately. And there's seems to be maybe a less focus in areas like fintech on biodiversity, specifically. There's also kind of thoughts that come out of this process that we've done around opportunities to leverage the climate finance and the climate change kind of train. We know that it was a slow and long process, and we're still maybe in the slow and long phase of it, but there's been real movement on climate change. We know that we've had decades of building both within the international system along the lines of COP and CBD, but also in terms of efforts that have built around it with regard to finance, things that will be familiar to people like the TCFD and now the NGFS. And there's a question around whether there's an opportunity to take that infrastructure, take some of that expertise, even take some of the synergies between climate change and biodiversity, and fast forward biodiversity through that. It's not clear there. It sounds like there should be, but it's not clear that there necessarily is. There's some risk of distracting the critical progress on climate change. Of course, there's a lot of complexity in thinking about how biodiversity sits across it. But from our review, it does seem that there's not as much of that yet surfacing as it seems there might be. And also, I think there's a sense of maybe a need for efforts that are able to take a greater risks, if that makes sense. We have I think in CBD we have a large process that's doing the kind of hard work of making slow and steady progress across many actors. When you look at the space, there's a question of whether there's opportunities to try to find more disruptive, high risk efforts that might be complete wastes in the end, but that will potentially, with a more bottom-up focus, find avenues that can accelerate change and perhaps create broader replication across the system than we're seeing so far. So that's a kind of a broad overview of what we've seen in the work we've been doing. It's not yet complete, so I wasn't able to provide summary slides, but I hope that gives people a good overview, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jason. Well, as a compliment to your presentation, I have people online asking to see your report. So, and I understand it will not be a public report, so we'll respond to these questions. But well, I'd like to stay with your last words, which is about maybe the opportunity. So, the opportunity for sort of high-risk disruptive elements. And I think you end with that, and I want to stay with that because I do think you painted a picture which is, how should I put it, rather that it's a challenge to get more activity in this field and really hope to make progress in the next 18 months or beyond. I think you also said there's quite a few actors busy, but a lack of interconnection. This workshop is certainly one way to bring people together and try to trigger this sort of collaboration and putting together the sometimes scarce resources we have. So collaboration for sure. I think you also mentioned something around sort of using climate as a springboard, as in taking the most advanced initiatives in the field of climate, and instead of just saying, oh, well, let's try to replicate them with biodiversity, which seems really a stretch. Whether, I mean, you said something about wherever biodiversity interlinks with climate systemically, then that's an opportunity to say, well, it's one of the same thing. Or there might be other ways to, just use that strong momentum and convince some of these key players to broaden their scope. So anyway, but you did paint a challenging picture, so there's definitely a lot to do. Is there any question here in the audience in terms of the bigger picture that Jason painted about financial institutions, governments, CSOs? I'm not sure I get the part in governments in terms of how much ambitious they are in this area. I think you mentioned in some specific countries there is leadership, but is it? Did you say indeed that they need to receive more pressure, or some of them should be encouraged to move up, or on the contrary, did you say that there is at least sort of verbal ambition?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to leave the impression there's a lot going on in government. No, I think there's, well, okay, I don't want to talk about sort of a broad policy ambition and how that ambition is getting expressed in the CBD process, for example. So, there are efforts that may have been mentioned earlier that are trying to draw together good coalitions through the G7 or a wider group of the G20 to get good political ambition, which of course would be critical to unlocking biodiversity friendly finance. I think there are things going on there. My comment was more about what's actually happening in these countries. And are there countries that are putting a biodiversity lens across a significant biodiversity lens across the way they're channeling, providing incentives for, or otherwise kind of supervising finance. And in general, there's very little, right? So as everyone will be aware, there are more substantive actions, of course, on climate change in that regard. And of course, there remains the traditional areas of natural preservation and things like that, but a very strong focus on things that would accelerate or channel investment. There's not that much, right? I mean, you've got some countries that are starting to build out more substantive frameworks of incentives, French, the UK, and there will be others among some of the most progressive developed countries are looking at things that might establish, clear incentives and linked to biodiversity related targets, but it's relatively incipient. was my main point.
Thank you.
And I guess to the point of what we were trying to do, right? What we were trying to do is not necessarily evaluate every country's policies. That's beyond the pale of what we try to do, but trying to understand where the initiatives are focused, that are the programs that are trying to influence countries. I guess the idea in finance and biodiversity, there's not as much that's getting into specific jurisdictions with specific areas of encouraging finance towards biodiversity friendly aspects and away from non-biodiversity friendly ones. There's relatively, as I was trying to say, in things that might be around traditional areas of preservation and even a little bit of the kind of direct incentives, payments for certain ecosystem services, but some efforts have been put into trying to get those things set up, that core regulation that would unlock finance. There's a lot less effort in terms of engaging at a local or national level on things like financial regulation or understanding and creating the right liabilities framework, so that there were clear financial risks involved in the destruction of biodiversity.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. We are a bit over time already, so keen to let people go as planned. Yeah, thanks a lot. There's a few things to say, but I'll be in touch with you in terms of concluding from your remarks. I mean, certainly some space for creating narratives, and it's been discussed in the previous session, creating strong narratives that ultimately did play a big role in the success in Paris about there is no status quo, as Rens van Tilburg put it, in terms of, either you're going to get the physical environmental risk or the transition risk, but there's nothing like business as usual, and maybe you getting a few indicators, but I think on the side of campaigning, maybe connecting some of the youth movement to themselves broaden the scope to create political pressure. But anyway, thanks a lot for that. Thanks to everyone. What should I say before we close? Sorry for the technical difficulties sometimes. I think this is the way to go anyway. We'll have to get used to this. Not the technical problems, but making sure it works better in the future. We'll be releasing our reports just in a few days, so we'll be in touch with you. There's an important conference here in Brussels next week, Thursday and Friday, at an EU level, and what the EU strategy on biodiversity should be, including a finance component. So you might want to check that out. And now I'm inviting you here in Brussels to have a glass of wine. We had looked